Good evening and welcome to NNPA's live stream with the great and the iconic author, Tananarive Due. Welcome.
Thank you.
Oh
I'm
my goodness.
excited to be here.
Yes, we're excited to have you. And for those who have been living under a rock, we have this big thing going on called the Afro Comic Con Festival that's happening on Saturday. And I have curated the film festival, which starts on Saturday. And so you are my kickoff guest. So I'm so excited about having you here.
Wow.
You are kicking off the whole festival, which is going to start at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, which is 7 a.m. on the West Coast. So thank you for doing this for us. We really appreciate you.
I'm thrilled, and I'm thrilled you're doing this.
Well, thank you. Thank you. All right. So for those who may not know who I'm talking to, which you should, and if you don't, then Google. But right now we're going to talk a little bit about your work, and then we're going to follow that up and talk about the executive producing that you did on the documentary, critically acclaimed and award-winning documentary, Horror Noire, A History of Black Horror. And then we'll just take it from there. How about that?
That sounds amazing.
All right. So let me know, when did you know that you were interested in science fiction, and when did you start calling it Afrofuturism?
You know, I think a lot of children are sort of born as science fiction writers. So when I was very young, I wrote a series of little picture books about a kid named Chris Manning who had a talking cat. So that was sort of that fantasy element. And I wrote a short story about stowing away on a spaceship. I think kids sort of have it driven out of them, really. You know, it was only as I was an older writer, as I was exposed to canon, that I started writing out many aspects of who I was as an artist. So the genre seemed to be frowned upon in my creative writing classes. The race was non-existent in a lot of the stories that we were assigned. So, you know, true story, by the time I was in graduate school, I went to the University of Leeds in England as a Rotary Foundation scholar. By the time I was in graduate school, I was writing a novel about two white men that had no speculative element, whatever, except for the built-in speculative element that I was pretending to be a white man, like trying to channel the experiences. And that wasn't a marketing choice. That wasn't me trying to figure out how to get it. No, that was just the story that came to me. So that'll tell you how far flung I had been from where I began as a young Black girl writing stories about stowing away on a spaceship, a little Black girl stowing away on a spaceship, or a little Black girl trying to get in the Guinness Book of World Records and all that. So I embraced it in 1992. I can tell you the exact year. It was the year of Hurricane Andrew in Miami. Yeah, Miami. And out of that experience, which Miami was just turned upside down, my home neighborhood, my aunt's house, my parents' house, a lot of damage. It felt like being in an alternate reality. So of course I got the idea for The Between, which was a novel about alternate realities. And I wrote, again, I was still writing male. I wrote a Black male, but he was Black. At least I was moving toward myself. So I wrote a Black male protagonist. And I remember writing to my sister asking, do you think there's an audience for this? Because see, I had never read Octavia Butler at that age.
Really?
No, I hadn't. I wish. So I had never seen an example of what I thought was a Black horror novel or a Black science fiction novel, and now I was thinking about marketing. Is there an audience for this? And honestly, even in the wake of that, and My Soul to Keep on the Way in 1997, when I was at Clark Atlanta University, when they did their groundbreaking Black speculative fiction conference. It was called the African American Fantastic Imagination, Explorations in Science Fiction, Fantasy, and Horror. I had just been published. I was like the last newcomer to get through the gate. And I was on a panel of giants. Octavia E. Butler was there. First time I met her. Samuel R. Delaney, who was a pioneer in the 1960s and one of Octavia's teachers at Clarion. Stephen Barnes, who had also been publishing and had been on written for The Outer Limits and Twilight Zone. And Jewel Gomez, who was out there groundbreaking with I know her novel's name, The Gilda Stories. Queer vampire novel. So I was like the newbie on that stage, and it was groundbreaking. But even then, we weren't calling it Afrofuturism. I don't remember hearing the term until much later, almost to the point where I started teaching it at UCLA just about 4 or 5 years ago. It was in public discourse. Mark
Yeah.
Derry had coined the term in the 90s, before Clark Atlanta, but I don't think we refer to ourselves as Afrofuturists, and only have come to refer to ourselves as Afrofuturists in a large part, I think, because the term has taken such a stronghold. You know, so many people know it. Yeah, so that's that.
Okay. Yeah, and Clark Atlanta also gave us Waitasha Womack, who I will be interviewing in November.
Great. She
yeah,
wrote the book Afrofuturism. That is.
Yes, yes, absolutely, absolutely. So, about talk about how you work. What is your process? Like, you know, do your characters come to you? Tell me, what is your process when you write your novels? Yeah.
It's a little bit different every time. I'm teaching a Black Horror course right now at UCLA. So, and we were just discussing my novel, The Good House. So that's at the top of my mind.
Yes.
I was living in the Pacific Northwest, very isolated racially and culturally. And I was trying to find a way to get through my last 2 years in the Pacific Northwest. So what came to me was first using my art as a form of self-care. And I think that was my earliest lesson as a young writer, even as a child. You know, Miami had a rebellion in 1980 after the beating death of a motorcyclist named Arthur McDuffie. And that was the first time I thought, oh, writing could actually save my life one day, because I felt horrible before I started writing, and then I felt better after writing. So I've been applying that. The same thing happened with The Between after the hurricane. So I'm taking trauma. And I think that's why I chose horror. My mother loved horror. My late mother, Patricia Stephens Due, was a civil rights activist who bore very real scars from the movement because of sensitivity to light after she had tear gas thrown in her face, literally a canister thrown in her face by a police officer. So I think the way she treated her trauma was by watching horror movies and exposing me to those horror movies. And then she gave me my first Stephen King novel. So from that point on, it was taking real life horror and finding ways to sort of disguise it in my fiction. So I took my own feelings of isolation, a tragedy that had befallen a friend of mine when her son committed suicide, a strange incident that sounded a little bit like a demonic possession I had heard about. Like every piece of trauma from that era, it's like a big gumbo that I stirred up. And that is what becomes my story. So if I was feeling like a fish out of water in the Pacific Northwest, my character is also feeling like a fish out of water in the Pacific Northwest, and on and on and on. And that has been how I access story. Sometimes premise first, like what if there were a demon that were following a family for generations, which is what that turned out to be. And then find the right character who's the perfect person to experience the trauma.
Right. Now, it's interesting that you talk about trauma and using the writing and this particular genre to work your way through the trauma, because there's a lot of pushback happening now. And we're going to talk about the rise of Black science fiction, Afrofuturism in television and film. But there's some pushback from some critics, but audience members, you know, people you see on social media, and they talk about how it's a form of trauma porn. Like it's you know, some particularly Lovecraft and some of those other shows that are coming out. But they're saying that the cruelty is something that is for the gaze of white people. It's not really for us. What do you think about that? Uh-oh. Frozen screen, no. Okay, so what I'm talking about. Okay, what I'm talking about is the rise of these shows like Lovecraft. And I wouldn't call them the rise of, but Lovecraft is relatively new. Watchmen. I just read about a show that Black science fiction show that Regina King is going to be directing, which is called Slay. We also have, obviously, you know, it's science fiction and superhero comic book Black Lightning on the CW has been super popular as well. And so we have this genre that has been emerging. And so, of course, we love it, right? Because people want to see this. Of course, there was Black Panther and all these other types of films and film and television shows. But and people love that we've had these opportunities to explore these kinds of themes and to be represented in science fiction. John Boyega from Star Wars has been kind of mired in a conflict of sorts as it relates to how his character was used in Star Wars. How his character was used in Star Wars, or not used, or underutilized in the sequels to Star Wars. And so when we think about that, in addition to some of the critiques that people have been having about this genre, which is that there's too much trauma, right? That it is kind of like, they call it trauma porn. This idea that trauma is something that is for the Black trauma is for the pleasure of others. So it was interesting when Tananarive was talking about how she used writing to work herself out of that trauma. Okay.
I hope
You know,
my
that's
wired
okay.
connection went out. I'm on the wireless, so I hope it'll hold up as well. I mean, or better, frankly.
That's okay. Yeah, I've just been telling them about, giving them a little bit of information
Thank you.
about.
So sorry about that.
Yeah, so let's pick up where we left off. But I was saying that with trauma, you were talking about how you use your writing to write your way out of trauma.
Yeah.
But some of the pushback that people have been saying about some of the more recent shows that are kind of emerging is that they call it trauma porn, but it's really that they believe that that Black trauma is really something that is for the gaze of whites. It's something that white viewers have a perverse pleasure for. And so what we're seeing, particularly on television, is really for them. What are your thoughts about that?
I don't feel like Lovecraft Country is intended for a white gaze, but I do think that Black horror creators in particular are going to have to sort of have a reckoning as we try to balance the desire to express trauma visually, especially racial trauma, without re-traumatizing our audiences, and that's something that as a horror creator, I'm thinking about. I just, my husband, Stephen Barnes, and I just finished a script where that's traditional horror, action horror, with some ghosts attacking a Black fraternity, members of a Black fraternity and the people who are with them. And it's like, how many kills do you have? How graphically do you have those kills? Because when we see our bodies bloodied and splayed on a screen, it does remind us a lot of headlines and family histories and our fears for our own children and relatives and engagements with police and outside of the house and all kinds of violence. So it's a real balancing act. I think it's one of the things that hurt Jonathan Demme's Beloved when it came out in the 1990s, adapted from Toni Morrison's novel, starring Oprah. When I look back on it now, it's such a beautiful film. But it's very, very difficult in terms of the violence. And when slavery and the ghost of slavery literally is the monster, how do you express the monstrosity of slavery visually without leaving your audiences feeling kind of ripped apart emotionally? And like they have those whip scars on their backs, you know what I mean? And that's so it's going to be a balancing act. I am thrilled about Lovecraft Country. I mean, every piece of art is worthy of critique, of course. But for me, from the pilot, and there are several standout episodes for me, I thought it did a really excellent job of kind of externalizing what racism and trauma from racism feels like. Like the lonely road, and the police officer who stops you on the lonely road is more monstrous than the monster, right? And I felt like there are several notes that are just right in that sense. The Gordon Parks photos that were recreated in the frames, and like iconic Jim Crow photography, validating historical experiences, being at Emmett Till's funeral. I was kind of like, oh shoot, we're going to a funeral. It's like it's very visceral, and I think ultimately it expresses something that is very real and something that is very tangible that often we haven't been able to put into words, much less images, right? But at the same time, going forward, I think all of us, and again, I don't pick on anybody because, I'm struggling with my own stuff. Like, how do I how do I not marginalize other groups in my work in trying to make myself visible? How do I not re-traumatize an audience using horror tropes? Like the example I use is, if you're a Black horror creator, it would be hard to just do a Friday the 13th movie, right?
Right.
A bunch of Black kids in cabins in the woods getting killed one after the other in creative ways is like, okay, you could do that maybe, but what if the killer is white? And then what if the killer's a racist who's calling them the N-word while he's killing them? At what point is that not fun, right?
Right.
And I'm not a big slasher movie person, precisely because I do like redemptive horror. I do like more characterization than you typically get in a slasher movie like that. But I use that as an example because death has to have meaning. Violence has to have meaning. And I think, having a high kill count in a Black horror movie probably would not serve the audience the same way audiences felt served by watching a Friday the 13th. So we can't just like hold up a mirror to what has been before and try to recreate that with Black skin. We have to reinterpret what horror means. We have to, and are there ways other than killing and blood and violence to express horror in perhaps even more powerful way? And I think generally speaking, Monkey Paw and Jordan Peele are very mindful of this. When you look at, say, Get Out and Us, in terms of the treatment of the Black bodies.
Yes, I would agree. Yes, holistically.
So I think it's in our minds, but it's something that we're going to bump up against because we've been historically, cinematically, and in television history, horror looks like a certain thing, and we can't always just flip that thing and serve our audience.
Right. And the other piece of that is, I think Misha Green is just doing, in terms of, because you were talking about Lovecraft, and I thought about the kind of fantasy elements of Underground, which I thought were done brilliantly. But this idea of reimagining the ways in which you can tell these types of stories, it's just revolutionary in and of itself. It's not new for people who have been doing this type of Black speculative fiction, who've been doing this type of work. But for audiences, particularly television audiences, it is new, it is different, and it is a different way of thinking about it. So I agree with you. This is the film and TV scholar in my head, but I agree with you holistically when you talk about us having to, as Black audience members, having to be mindful of layering on these ideas or these prior ways of seeing.
Yes.
Particularly with genres that are very well known because they are fan favorites, and to think about them or conceptualize it in a way that is different and constructive, but also recognizes the value in the actual text, like a Lovecraft and the work that Misha Green is doing. Yeah.
I mean, you're so right. I mean, I just have to marvel for a moment about the difference between, say, then and now. Like in 1997, when I was invited to Clark Atlanta, you could fit most of us on a stage. I mean, there were some people who weren't there, like Linda D. Addison, who had been publishing about this, earlier when I started publishing. But for the most part, you could fit them all, in a few seats. And when I was at Spelman, I had a couple of Octavia Butler conferences and I had it 2 years in a row. And each year I had way too many panelists because I really could have filled the auditorium and probably beyond the auditorium with the creators now who are writing what we would call Afrofuturism, which I define as the Black speculative arts. It's a very broad definition. Some people would be more specific about it with the futurism and the science fiction and technology. But for me, Afrofuturism is the Black speculative arts, and I mean the diaspora Black speculative arts. Although Nigerian-American writer Nnedi Okorafor has coined the term African futurism, which is a very specific kind of writing and futurism. But back in the day, listen, as a writer in the 1990s, trying to come in the in the wake of Terry McMillan, I had a lot of explaining to do with those book clubs about my immortal blood and my alternate realities. I was a hard sell in some of those book clubs because what I was writing was so different. And now what we see
the writing was impeccable. Writing was impeccable. My Soul to Keep, The Living Blood, that trilogy, impeccable. Like there was no way that those books because not only did they introduce something new and meaningful to large audiences, they also demonstrated that you can have different types of genres. Black people can have different types of genres that are still impeccably written and visually stunning. And those books were that. Okay, I'm out. Go ahead.
God, oh, well, I really appreciate that. I appreciate
that.
It's, it's been a minute since I started publishing. So like I was saying earlier, I'm just glad people remember me. But one of the offshoots, and I think this has been going on for literature for a while, the 90s gave birth to some great, because, there's room for everybody when everybody's thriving. So we saw a lot of films that were romantic comedies and mysteries, and then that kind of dried up for a while, and also it dried up on the literary side. But I think first on the literary side, it started to flourish again. I can't say all the factors that contributed to it. Maybe it was just enough readers were demanding it. Octavia E. Butler and the rise of the knowledge of Octavia and her work helped open doors for people to read other fantasy and science fiction. But on the cinematic side, it's the 1-2 punch of Get Out and Black Panther that were the big wake-up call to Hollywood. And it's like, oh, so it's not just because there's no like sort of just innate desire, like we have to represent Black people in science fiction and horror more. That was not a thing. Okay, it was all about, oh shit, Get Out made $250 million. And then people started this thing of actually putting Black actors and scripts that were meant for white actors, and then you open a whole other can of worms, because you can't always, sometimes that can work beautifully, because we are at our core just human and our stories are universal. But there are elements sometimes where adding that difference in race in a so-called race neutral script raises more questions than it answers, and traumatizes in unintended ways when Black viewers are watching it. So there's going to be
acting in it, like a John Boyega, right?
Right.
Okay.
Right. So and I try not to. I really, as a creator myself, especially as someone who's starting screenwriting now, and I'll have my turn in the barrel. I know when I finally get my stuff out there, I try not to like single too many projects out and say, no, that's not it. But I think as a general rule, I think people need to understand, you can't just always flip that script and make characters Black without addressing race in the story, because race is a part of life. So remember that, and have some sensitivity readers and consultants guide you as you go, because yes, you are going to make mistakes doing that. You just are.
Right. Yes, and let me name check Dr. Kristen Warner, who has written about this extensively and has a book on the very subject of this whole idea of colorblind casting and why it's problematic and what we should be thinking about and considering. So anyway, continue.
And the other problematic aspect of it, and I can think of some projects I've really enjoyed that did that, and it worked just great, right? But the flip side of that is that you're using a script from someone who's already in the pipeline.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And that person is just sort of putting the script in blackface, rather than opening an opportunity for a Black artist who's been trying to shop their script, telling a story. And again, a Black artist isn't necessarily going to have a story about race either. There's a good example on Netflix, J.D. Dillard, a movie called Sweetheart, that has a biracial lead. It's a sea creature story. Race has nothing to do with that story, except that this lead has brown skin, and therefore that it just infuses the story with sort of a different shade, no pun intended, the way with George A. Romero, Night of the Living Dead in 1968 becomes a story about social upheaval and fear of the rise of Blackness, because of the casting of a Black actor in Dwayne Jones. But give those Black creators a shot. That's probably my biggest problem with the colorblind casting aspect, is these scripts that have been kicking around. No one was quite interested enough to get it made, but it's like, now that Black is in, as was said famously, Black is in and Get Out, let's hire some Black actors and elevate a screenwriter who's already in the pipeline, rather than opening the door and inviting more marginalized creators to submit their stories.
Right. No, I mean, you are exactly right. And, sometimes even with students, and, your professor at UCLA, this idea, they have this idea, and, I think it's also fans, audiences, people who don't really understand how the industry works as a business. But this idea that it's just like this kumbaya moment that like all of a sudden it's like, oh, we're going to do Black stuff because we like Black people again. And it's like, nah, have you looked at that? That's not it. It's because Black Panther made a ton of money. It's
right.
Because, these television shows that are on the networks are drawing in lots of audiences. And so they can make money off of it. And that's not a bad thing because it's industry, right? That's why we call it the entertainment industry. But what is problematic is exactly what you raised. It's like, who gets to tell those stories? And if we're talking about something as specific and the way that you define Afrofuturism or Black speculative fiction, if we're talking about something that's specific and Black writers have really owned that space for as long as we have, then it just makes sense that they would bring in more Black writers who are working in that space to mine, those stories and to tell their stories. Particularly because Hollywood loves to do that, right? They love to find books that have sold, Stephen King, for instance. I was just talking about him with one of my students, but Stephen King, just finding whatever novel he puts together, and they can find a space for it, but they don't bring in just anybody, or just they don't bring in anybody or just let anyone. And Stephen King is kind of exceptional, but you know what I'm saying? Like his stories, he's able to tell his stories, or if they bring in someone or it's adapted, they try to make sure that they bring in someone who can who is in keeping with the mood, the tone, the information, the context around the novel. And so with Black speculative fiction and Afrofuturism, yes, we do need more Black writers in those spaces. And we need those Black stories that have already been written to be converted and told in a televisual.
Yeah, it's criminal that Octavia Butler's work has not been on the screen yet. What? I mean, what? So no wonder.
I mean, it's so beautiful because Dawn, and I'm gonna shut up because I know you're but Dawn, that was the first book I read that visualized all of the because I was raised in a Black nationalist household, but it was the first book I read that visualized all of the history, past, present, and future, like the Sankofa, if you will, the Adinkra symbol. It actually visualized it for me in a way that was in a book. Of course, there was the movie Halle Jarima's work, but there's the book. And that's so necessary for I think a Black person who's really trying to figure out who they are in the past as they move forward towards the future, and to kind of have that kind of work exist and to find that, because I found myself in that book, but I hadn't found myself in that book, and I read all of Stephen King's novels,
Right.
I never saw myself in his novels, but that was the first time I saw myself in a science fiction,
Yeah, in a way you almost don't realize how much you've been erased until you see a book where you're centered, which is why I am sorry I didn't discover Octavia earlier. Honestly, I went through a whole lot just to come back to myself. And there is some of her work in the pipeline for adaptation, but it takes a long time. And it's taken this long because there is no innate desire on the part of the industry to tell these stories. People almost had to take to the street. I mean, literally, to get the kinds of changes in Hollywood that I think we can count on for a little while. But trust, there are people who are like, ooh, I can't wait till things are back to normal. That is a thing. I know that for a fact. But even so, what did it take to get these commitments? And of course, your writer's room should, if you have a cast that includes people of color, of course, your writer's room should reflect that, too. Otherwise, people end up with blind spots and reheated tropes. And, someone is mentioning in the comments, like, isn't part of the appeal that the stories are for everyone. But yeah, all stories are for everyone. That's the thing. There is, through the specific, you get to the universal, which is why I, as a little Black girl, could feel like I was Danny in The Shining because I was living that story through him and I was just in the story. And that's something that white viewers and readers are learning how to do more, right? Yeah, that's something that we've always had to do, or we wouldn't have been able to enjoy mass entertainment.
That is true. Yes, absolutely.
So I think that the notion that there's, a story, Black horror is for Black viewers. Like in Horror Noire, Jordan Peele said he made Get Out for everyone, right? But if it didn't work for Black viewers, then it's a fail. So in that sense, it's for Black viewers. Like, it's not for a white gaze. And I think it is true sometimes that artists who have been conditioned by years and years and years of trying to pitch in Hollywood, that sometimes we do feel like that tragic ending is what we need, because that's what really moves white audiences. When maybe the Black audience, rather than feeling moved like that, again, wants to feel some triumph and joy at the end. How about that? How about that's what the radical story right now is, to go through all the levels of hell and come out victorious and triumphant, not to die again.
Right. And can you talk about, I mean, because, you know, you and Stephen Barnes, ooh, love that. But Black love, that is one of the things I love about the genre, or the category, or the broad category of Afrofuturism, is that Black love, or love between Black people, is so intense and is so pure. We don't really get to see love in a holistic way.
Yes,
relates to Black people, and the way that we love, and how we are vulnerable and tender with the ones that we love, and that we have chosen as our partners. We don't see that in mainstream media, but one place you absolutely see it, and actually are seeing it in the television shows and the films that are being made. They're capturing that piece of it. Even in Black Lightning, where the couple is divorced, you still see that they actually love each other. They just kind of can't live together, you know?
Right.
Talk about that a little bit too, like the importance of that, or your thoughts around it.
It's supremely important. You know, I just tweeted, there's some memes going around today about fathers and their children, and hugs between fathers, Black fathers and Black sons, or, you know, or Black fathers and Black daughters. It's just something we need to remind ourselves, that we are not the way we are portrayed. You know, I'm sure people are incredulous sometimes when they hear the studies that say that Black men who are involved in their children's lives are more involved in their children's lives. You know, that's a thing, that's a study, you know, and there are so many people who feel that we didn't exist. Part of what's driving sort of white nationalist thinking is the lie that we weren't here before. You know what I mean?
Right.
Every movie from the 1930s or the 1940s, we were absent, or we were cooning, or we were you know, underrepresented. So that's what they thought the country was, and that somehow we are now usurpers and interlopers, and it's like, no, we're not actually. So we've always been here. I don't know if you've heard, but California used to be a part of Mexico. So we're, you know, this whole nation has always been a multicultural nation. That notion that it was a white nation was never real, and that's something that's been perpetuated in media. So
they weren't white either when they got here. I mean, you know, and that is true. That's not you know, whiteness is a category that has been constructed. It's a social construction in the same way that we construct other things. But the idea is, and this is academic, but it is the idea that whiteness is just some inherent piece of your life, or that you're born that way, particularly in this country, is false. That is something that came about through the intersectionality of class and race, and you determining or deciding where you wanted to fall in the caste system that was here, and that is, of course, tied to capitalism. Okay, so anyway, back to you. So I just wanted to say that I had to put that out there. Like, whiteness is not, you know, whiteness is a social construction, just like everything else. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, I remember once when I first started publishing, I was talking to a woman just casually on a plane, an older white woman, and she asked me, "Oh, what do you write?" And I said, "Well, I write horror novels with Black characters." And she said, "Oh, why do the characters have to have a color?" Right? Because this is whiteness as default, right? Yeah. And there's somehow something threatening me about me saying that, and also something exclusionary, like it's not for her, but that's in her mind. Because, you know, and it's a mindset that it's going to take a while to overcome, because unfortunately a lot of us have absorbed these attitudes about ourselves and about how representation should look and feel and that sort of thing. So it's yeah, there's a lot to overcome, but I've been so amazed by the rapid changes in And let's speak on that for a moment.
Mm-hmm.
Why is the speculative so exciting right now? I do a monthly webinar series with Reverend Monica A. Coleman called Octavia Tried to Tell Us, Parables for Today's Pandemic.
Yes.
About, am I frozen?
You're frozen.
Oh, okay. I do a monthly webinar with Dr. Monica A. Coleman called Octavia Tried to Tell Us, Parables for Today's Pandemic, speaking to how prescient her work was, but also the seeds of hope that are hidden within her parable series with Earthseed, The Only Lasting Truth is Change, which I have found to be an actual tool that got me through election night in 2016, just because I couldn't wrap my mind around it until those words came back to me. So I think that we're wanting to make up for not having been visualized in the future, because there were no Black people in the original Star Wars, which again, some of the very people who complain about the rise of the Black speculative in cinema or in literature wouldn't notice or care that we were excluded from the original Star Wars and so many science fiction films that predated Star Wars. We were not in that future. There was no space for us, desire for us in that future. And it's a kind of visual genocide, isn't it?
Yeah.
Where did we go? So there's a lot of work to be made up for, right? There's a lot of work to be made up for. The speculative opens imagination. You see a lot of that in Lovecraft Country, especially the fantasy elements more so than the horror itself. Feeling scenes of empowerment, multiverses, just, time travel, which is something we're not afforded because where would we go in the past,
right.
And why? But just, there's so much to make up for. And the speculative space helps people open their imaginations so that we can see beyond our current fears, our current station, and have to remember, I was at a conference with Angela Davis a couple of years ago, and the topic of Afrofuturism came up. I think it was called Black Women Rise. It was in Florida. And since we were talking about the speculative, I asked her how she keeps her sunny disposition after everything she's been through. Because if anybody has a right to just be mad and in a bad mood all the time, a radical who's been in prison like Angela Davis, right?
Yes, absolutely.
And yet, if you meet her, she's just the sweetest and softest person. And I was like, how do you do that? And her answer, to paraphrase, was basically that it's not that she looks through the world through rose-colored glasses. She gets that this is a struggle, and frankly, a struggle we won't live to see. It's a struggle of hundreds of years. Yeah. Like our mother passed away and missed Trump, but she knew Trump was coming or someone like him. She already saw the clock turning back. So it's a little forward, a little back. Anyway, I digress. What she said was, but if we're going to do the work to create this kind of future, no matter who we are and how we do it, artists, activists, if we're going to do that work, we have to believe that future is possible.
Yes.
Without that belief, what's the work for? And yeah, you're going to burn out if you expect it to happen in 5 years. And not that it's not legitimate to feel rage and deep grief about setbacks. The Breonna Taylor case is outrageous.
Outrageous, yeah.
Outrageous. But then again, if you're working for abolition, then that's also looking backward to the old solutions that never worked for us anyway, never worked in our favor. Criminal justice never worked in our favor. It's not going to start working in our favor now. So how does a society without policing and prisons look? And whether we can envision that or not, because I'm one of these people. I don't know what that looks like. I still want justice for Breonna. I still want some people in jail. I'm not going to lie. I'm still struggling.
A lot of people do. Yeah.
Wanting to see justice like I know justice to be, but the right people in jail as opposed to the wrong people in jail. But at the same time, I do think it's very important for all of us. This is what the imagination does. Open up an imagination then. What would it look like if we didn't have prisons? What would it look like if we didn't have policing? What's the first step toward that? And for me, that first step is juvenile justice. I just saw a statistic today, and I think it's low, but it said that 10% of Black girls are incarcerated in juvenile justice for things that aren't even crimes if you're an adult. Disobedience, skipping school, running away, right? That those aren't even real things in
Right.
terms of crimes.
Right.
Yet we have hundreds, perhaps thousands of our children locked up for those very dubious reasons. So if I can imagine a world where we incarcerate fewer juveniles, where we substitute social services for incarceration, where we do parenting workshops, where we give people money that they need.
Right.
I mean, let's just be real. So much of it, the root of it is not being able to provide, not having the funds, not having the rec centers in your neighborhood, not having the programs. I can see a world without juvenile incarceration.
Absolutely.
And if I can see that, that's the next step to the rest of it. So, I may not be there yet. I still want to see some police officers in jail.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you said that, because I interviewed Breonna Taylor's lawyer, and in talking to her, she was talking about, of course, they still want to see justice for Breonna. They're still fighting for it. And she was talking about the AG and how she didn't agree with what he did, and his instructions to the grand jury. But what struck me the most was that she was saying, she said, quote, I want justice for Breonna and for the future Breonnas. And I thought about that when you just were talking about Angela Davis and about to where we kind of came here at this moment. But this idea of, one of the ways in which Angela Davis or people who do that kind of work can keep going is because they can imagine a future that is different. But also, they also are very clued in to the process and how long it actually takes, right? And that's what struck me about Breonna Taylor's attorney, because she already knows that there are going to be other Breonnas and that this is going to be a long haul, but she can see that there's going to be justice at the end of that road. And that, to me, just is such an important element of Black speculative fiction, right? This idea of imagining the world that you want to live in, seeing yourself in places and not seeing yourself in places that are part of our society and what have you, changing your role or your experience, but anyway.
And it's all in the realm of the imagination, So we have to imagine ways to work for justice, or whatever justice means to us, while at the same time finding ways to nurture ourselves outside of any external influence. That we don't need the validation of a system, that we, what does that look like? What does self-care look like? So that you don't burn out in movement spaces, as so many people do, or frankly neglect their own families and relationships, as so many people did in the 60s, I know, certainly. So they did all that work, but their own children ended up in jail. It's just, so that's all about the realm of the imagination. What is a different future? How does a different future look? One profound example I had from that was teaching a speculative fiction workshop at Voices of Our Nation's Arts Foundation. It's called VONA, and it's a workshop for writers of color. And just based on a news story about a town that was for sale, my speculative fiction group, for their final project, basically created a pamphlet and a pitch for a utopia for Black and marginalized people. And that was their final project. And then, lo and behold, a couple months later, in real life, I read that a group of families had bought that same town. Right? So, and that was such a great example to me of how imagination works. So they didn't have the means and they didn't have the follow through, but the imagination, somebody else also had that imagination, and they did have the means and they did have the follow through.
Okay. So we're nearing the end, but I want to talk to you more about what you're working on. Now, for our viewers, in case you don't know, Tananarive is an American Book Award winner. She's an NAACP Image Award winner. She's a British Fantasy Award winner. And of course, her work has been included in the Best of the Year anthologies. I just finished reading Atlanta Noir, by the way. And she and her husband, Stephen Barnes, who's also her collaborator, wrote A Small Town for season 2 of the Twilight Zone, which was exciting. Fantastic.
Thank you.
So what you got going on? Tell us. I'm gonna have to have you back when you have more time, because we gotta really dig in.
Well, I can't just be
working on. What are you working on?
I can't just be casual. Like, I write a Twilight Zone episode every day, because that was my first. That was my first television that I wrote. Horror Noire, I was an executive producer, but this was something that I co-wrote. my name in the credits, got to go to the set. That was like right before COVID, like, I mean, weeks before the shutdown. I got to see Damon Wayans Jr. shooting that episode. And I'm just going to say really quickly, I hadn't realized the setting in a small town, again, cinematically, is not a space that people of color are accustomed to seeing themselves reflected. So I was a bit surprised, but pleased by, you know, a reviewer, or rather someone who interviewed the director about how casually all these characters of color were populating this town. The minister is a Black woman. Damon Wayans Jr. is the lead. There's a Latino family. Subtle racial divide, but not really that much. I'd say probably far less than we wrote in our original version of the script. Just, you know, it just because you don't need to shout in TV and film. You know, you can get the message across just with the story a lot of the time. So that was a big threshold for me. And I had another big threshold during the pandemic when I finished a novel I've been writing for 7 years. And it's very near and dear to my heart. It's called The Reformatory. I haven't even sold it yet. It's that fresh. But, and I'm going to say it here because this is just about to happen. This is the first time in my career I've optioned a novel for TV before it was even published. Wow. That's just how. Thank you so much. I'm so excited. And I think it's actually going to be announced in the next few weeks. Unlike most of these deals where you never get to talk about it until 2 years later, I think we can actually talk about it. But this is near and dear to me because it's a fictionalized version of the Dozier School for Boys in Marianna, Florida, the topic of Colson Whitehead's novel, The Nickel Boys, which I still haven't read, and you'll see why in a minute. Right after my mother passed, about a year after she passed away, I got a call from the Florida State Attorney General's office. Never mind who she is. It was just her office, not her. And I learned that I had a great uncle who had been buried on the grounds of the Dozier School in Marianna, Florida. And if you're not aware of the Dozier School, juvenile prison, okay, a so-called reformatory where they sent wayward boys. Sometimes they were runaways. Sometimes their families were just too poor to look after them. Families got paid for sending their kids there. They picked crops. They were picking the crops for the whole county with the corn. So it was a labor camp. It was a prison. And there were so many boys who died there that it has its own cemetery. So my husband and I and our son, who then was about 9, I think, all went to Marianna for the start of the exhumations of remains to try to identify, because they're unmarked graves. Like you would send your child there, and then you might just get a letter saying, oh, by the way, he died. We buried him, period. And no other in lies. Anyway, I don't get me started. It's horrific. So when I said in Horror Noire, Black history is Black horror. And certainly what Lovecraft Country is trying very hard to get across is Black history is Black horror, right? That's what I'm talking about, because it wasn't only Black boys who were sent there, but it was a segregated facility. And of course they got the brunt of the killings. Of course they got the brunt. In fact, their families were so excluded from the system, cowed by the system, that a lot of the people agitating for the investigations were white survivors' families, right? Because, and in every case, though, it was like their mother was never the same again. Of course, you know, their family was never the same again after their child was beaten to death or set on by dogs or just traumatized into old age after having been sexually abused. And what kept me going, it was a hard book to write, a very hard book to write. It's set in 1950. In Jim Crow, Florida. Like if I was going to have a nightmare, like what's the worst thing that could happen to you? It'll be waking up in 1950 in Jim Crow, Florida. And the research made me cry. It was a very difficult book to write, but I made it a ghost story so that again, trying to use that speculative element to blunt some of the real life pain, right? Because the facility is real and I want to honor the real violence that happened there, but I don't want to subject my 12-year-old character to the worst violence. I don't want to subject my readers to the worst violence. So ghosts will represent that past. You know, we every one of these boys died wrong. So, but we don't have to be there to see the deaths, right? And the ghosts the ghosts create, for me anyway, I hope, a framework through which to engage with the history, but through a prism that stands you at a safer distance. right? Because you're probably a ghost isn't going to come haunt you in your room tonight, probably. Or in other horror, probably you're not going to get possessed by a demon. So it doesn't feel as personal. It might be scary, but once the movie's over, it's done.
Right.
Whereas the more realistic horror is what kind of rings between our ears, because it's the same story for generations, and it's just old tears, and old nightmares. So that's the Reformatory. I'm so excited it's finally finished. And I the whole thing about the TV pitching and we're trying to do it as an 8-part series. And I just feel like I would love to have the opportunity to have that story told, but also in a way that helps me repair history as well.
Yeah.
As visualize some of the worst parts. But I don't want to give anything away, but let me just say the whole point of me writing this book was to repair history.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, I think is a great note to end on. That is fantastic. We'll have to talk. I'm going to bring you back so you can talk about your relationship with Jordan Peele and how you got him to come to your class. Because I know and all of those wonderful things. We need to discuss trade secrets.
Okay.
But without further ado, thank you so much.
Thank
you. Icon, you are an icon. I know you make you're very humble. I'm telling you, in the world, out in the world, you are loved. Your work is loved, and it is appreciated.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Appreciate you. Thank you for the work you're doing.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So for the rest of you, please join us this weekend, Saturday, October. It's all one word now. 24th. It's a blur at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Join us for Afro Comic Con. Check us out. Check out the film festival, which kicks everything off. It's going to be 7 a.m. On the West Coast, Tananarive. So if you can get up, do it. If not, you can later because it's going to be
great.
But yeah, join us this Saturday, and you are our kickoff artist. So thank you so much. Appreciate
you,
and wish you a fantastic rest of the week and a weekend.
You too.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.